So, that was a great warm-up to our next speaker. It's my distinct privilege to introduce our next speaker. Since January 2017, Dr. Peter Navarro has served as the first director of the White House Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy. He had previously been a senior economic and policy advisor to Donald J. Trump for president campaign. Before entering government service, Dr. Navarro was a professor at the Mirage School of Business at the University of California, Irvine. A macroeconomist by training, Dr. Navarro has published 10 books, including Crouching Tiger, What China's Militarism Means for the World, The Coming China Wars, Where Will They Be Fought, and How Can They Be Won, and Death by China, a global call for action. Dr. Navarro holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University, as well as an MPA from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Dr. Navarro truly has a strong passion for a strong and healthy U.S. industrial base. We're privileged to hear his thoughts. I was surprised this morning when I woke up and on prime time, which is when I'm able to watch TV, at 6 o'clock in the morning, there was Dr. Navarro on CNN. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Peter Navarro.
They always say, I saw you on TV. They never say anything about what you said or did. It's how'd they do? Oh, hey, it's great to be with y'all. Just a few thank yous here. Vice Admiral Andy Brown, retired president of this distinguished organization. I do want to thank him for the invite, along with Bill Woodhour, the vice chair. Where's General Marianne Miller? There she is. Air Mobility Command, thank you for hosting and being here. And Lieutenant General John Broadmeadow, there's the man. And finally, my good buddy, Honorable Mark Busby of MARAD, one of my favorite organizations in the government. We do a lot with merchant mariners, and this guy's on top of things. What I'd like to do today is kind of start at the 30,000-foot level, talk a little bit about what the president's doing in terms of this broad theme, economic security is national security, and then work down there to some of the issues facing us in terms of infrastructure. And so let me start by saying, if you look at some of the great past presidents, they've often been characterized by short but profound maxims that both guided their policies and led to some of their greatest successes. If you think about Teddy Roosevelt, walk softly, carry a big stick, that was the motivating idea and principle behind what was an incredible transformation from what essentially was a domestic-leaning Coast Guard to a global-reaching Navy. If you look at President Ronald Reagan, peace through strength, that was the guiding principle for what essentially was an innovative Star Wars strategy, a rebuilding of our defense industrial base, and the eventual downfall of the Soviet Union. And if that sounds familiar going forward, this president, President Donald J. Trump, has upped that ante in a way with this principle, which was first introduced in the 2017 National Security Strategy in December. The idea that economic security is national security. And the corollary to that is simply that a strong manufacturing base and defense industrial base is critical to both economic prosperity and national defense. And I can think of no principle more important than that to this room. because everything you do depends on this so-called fourth component, right? Which is to say that in conjunction with the military, the private sector, and industry, in terms of infrastructure, the air, sea, makes it all work if we're going to be able to defend the homeland and project power to the places that we need to do. And so this principle of economic security as national security is something that guides this president 24/7 in all of his policies. If you think about, we always get accused by our critics, left of center, of not having a strategy. When in fact the strategy is in front of everybody's face. Economic security as national security guides everything. If you think about tax cuts, what does that do? Tax cuts leads to increased investment, productivity, and a rebuilding of our manufacturing and defense industrial base. If you think about deregulation, you have a situation where that's what we call in the economics trade a pure supply-side stimulus, in that deregulation, led by Mick Mulvaney of OMB, doing a great job, lowers the cost of our manufacturers, makes us more competitive, and we're able to export more, produce more here, and it's all good. It builds us back up. If you think about one of the policies that my office is privileged to be the tip of the spear on, Buy American, Hire American. This president, through executive action, has been very successful about reinvigorating Buy American policies that go back more than 50 years, but which have not been enforced very well. But when we have a steel industry and an aluminum industry, and we have Buy American enforced, that builds up our manufacturing and defense industrial base. And really, is there any difference between those two? Not from your perspective. And steel and aluminum tariffs, of course. As the president has said, we don't have a country unless we have a steel and aluminum industry. And so even the tariffs that you see feed back in to building national economic power. And so the latest iteration in the president's many, many policies, this broad umbrella of economic security as national security, is something my office worked on for more than a year with the Defense Department and the interagency. And it was a historic event in that it was the first assessment of the defense industrial base ever undertaken by the government. And it's the first president since Dwight D. Eisenhower to both think and act strategically about the defense industrial base. And the output from that effort is a report that was released just last month by the Department of Defense. There was many, many agencies that worked on it. We had over 300 subject matter experts. The idea of this was to look at 9 different sectors like aircraft, shipbuilding, nuclear, and 6 cross-cutting sectors, cyber, machine tools, things like that. And if you think about it from a production standpoint, you have assembly plants, but you also have a 7-tier deep supply chain, right? So if you got to build an F-35 and you've got a component down in the 5th tier of the supply chain that maybe is in financial trouble after 8 years of sequestration, that would be a vulnerability in the defense industrial base. And if you tried to surge your production of those things, well, if we needed to, that could be a bottleneck. So what this assessment did was it identified close to 300 of those vulnerabilities. And we like to do things in Trump time, which is to say right away, when we submitted that report to the president, we also submitted a number of actions with that. We do things like use the Defense Production Act, Title III money, to help small firms that we need that exhibit one of those vulnerabilities. We only have, for example, one company that makes propeller shafts for some of the submarines that we need. We have one company that makes a lot of our rocket fuel. We have one depot that makes the turrets for our tanks. A second major area, though, of vulnerability was foreign dependencies. And a lot of that foreign dependency is the product of bad trade policies, which have offshored a lot of our production. But also strategic rivals like China are identified in that report as actually specifically targeting parts of our supply chain and industrial base. And we have to be very mindful of that. And if you think about it, it's like, I suspect most of you in this audience may not think that trade policy has anything to do with defense policy. But to quote Prime Minister Macron, au contraire, right? Because when we lose the ability to produce critical materials, beryllium, tungsten, other kinds of rare earths, when those go offshore for whatever reason, or when we don't have the capability to produce components for some of our night vision systems, that puts us at risk, particularly in a crisis or a surge. And people in this audience know better than most people in government and in defense what happens in surges, because it's you guys and gals, right, who are at the front lines when it hits the fan and you got to start moving a lot of stuff quickly, right? And we learned in the first Gulf War what happens when you rely on allies to get you what you need sometime. I don't know if some of you know this, but some of our trusted allies in Europe refused to ship some of the things we needed then. And that led to at least a 10-day delay getting boots on the ground where we needed to. And when you have 10-day delays, that gives the enemy time to dig in and create more risks and dangers. So my point here is simply that what we're trying to do as an administration is think globally about homeland security and national defense through this lens of economic security as national security, through the lens of, particularly in a democracy and a capitalist country, through the lens of defense and government working with the private sector. And that's a good transition now for me to just talk a little bit about what you folks do, because what we'd like to do, what we've learned from this assessment of the various sectors, is that it's long past time for an assessment as well of our infrastructure. And as successive TRANSCOM commanders have noted, our transportation links have faced years of underinvestment and often neglect that has produced significant strains and gaps. Our defense rail system is aging, faced chronic underinvestment, and we have significant foreign competition in rail cars that are critical for national defense. This fascinates me. It's like if you go to Australia and you ask the average Australian what happened to your rolling stock industry, they will tell you it was decimated within a matter of years, not decades, years, by a conscious Chinese strategy to go in and basically undercut domestic industry with stock, essentially, that was made with dump steel, heavily government subsidized, and just put that industry out of business. We are facing the same problem here. The Chinese right now are busy trying to take over our rolling stock industry. They've made great inroads bidding on things like public transportation systems in cities like Chicago, Boston, Los Angeles. And the problem is, always with the Chinese, is that you have a government that will heavily subsidize things like steel and aluminum, which is a major part of the cost of the rolling stock. They'll have other types of government subsidies, and then they'll steal your technology so they don't have to do the R&D. So when it comes time for an American company to bid on the rail car system in Chicago versus a Chinese company, it's not a fair fight. And so we're losing those unfair fights. And it's going to hurt us trying to fulfill the mission that you have been tasked with fulfilling. And so what this administration wants to do is rebuild our infrastructure, but to do it in a way which also recognizes the defense component. It's not just about moving commuters around cities faster, bridges and roads and things like that. It's not about getting planes in and out of airports quicker and safer. That's all extremely important. But there's also this overarching issue that TRANSCOM is basically the back office, right, of our defense system. It's your responsibility to make sure men, material, and everything in between gets to where it needs to be in Trump time, right? So what we hope to do in my office is to push forward with the next leg, essentially, of the Defense Industrial Base Assessment, turn our attention more towards this issue of infrastructure, and with your help, maybe we can take a pretty good look at that and then come up with some accelerated solutions so we can do that. The last thing I'll tell you, and then I'll see if you have a few questions on the magic scroller up here. Last thing I'll tell you is that my office works a lot on the merchant mariner shortfall. This is a very serious issue to us. It's around, depending on who you believe, around 2,000 mariners. And we are fierce defenders of the Jones Act. We're fierce defenders of cargo preference. There's a lot of fierce attackers of those pieces of legislation. And it's a continued struggle to raise awareness of just how significant that shortfall could be in the event of another surge. And so we're going to try to tackle that in many different ways. A very small way, which will soon be hopefully getting finished, is we're trying to make it so that sea veterans can seamlessly transition into the merchant marine without any undue obstacles and any delays in certification or things like that. That's part of a broader effort working with great people like Ivanka Trump and Secretary of Labor Acosta on helping our veterans transition into civilian professions more quickly. And so these are some of the kinds of things we're working on. I'm delighted to be here. I hope this has been helpful in terms of shedding a few lights on what we do. Let me see what you got on this board, if anything. Other than that, I'll go back to work here. So, anyway. If you got a question, I guess you type it in. We got one here. I can't believe it's about China. Why would that be? China already had a monopoly on rare earth minerals, yet they recently bought a U.S. mine which further tightens their grip on control of rare earth elements used in making high technology. How can this happen? How can the U.S. prevent the Chinese from monopolizing the rare minerals market? The good news is there's several initiatives now being pursued both inside the White House and inside branches of government to deal more broadly with the critical minerals, critical materials issue. We are painfully aware of these dependencies, thanks in large part to this report. And we're going to do our best to deal with that. You got some more there? You want to refresh that? Is that how that goes? Okay, here we go. I got it. You got it. Ah, a wonk. I won't ask you to raise your hand. I know who you are. Can you please discuss the interplay between comparative advantage and protectionism? I feel like I'm back at UC Irvine in the classroom here. Can tariffs on imports on foreign flag ships be used to increase U.S. flag shipping? Let me just talk a little bit about the free trade model and the function of tariffs. Okay, and I always find it amusing when I get attacked for being a flatlander protectionist who doesn't know anything about economics, because of course we know that free trade model works. And I always get amused by that because I've taught that model for 20 years. And I won't say that nobody knows that model better than me, but I dare say there might be nobody in this room who does. And it's the model is that basically if you enter into trade with another country, right, you're going to use your resources more efficiently. There should be a bigger pie and therefore more to share. Okay, that sounds great. Sounds great. Okay. The problem is that whole model is predicated on the simple concept of floating exchange rates, which make it affirmative that there's never anybody that runs a trade deficit, right? So if I'm trading with the general here, right, and he starts running up a surplus on me, my currency gets lower relative to his because my dollars are piling up over there. And I sell him more exports, I buy a few of his imports, and things come back into balance, right? The problem with the free trade model is that these adjustments haven't taken place. And this country has run persistent trade deficits that have gotten ever bigger going back to the 1970s. And right now, as the president has said many times, we ship off about $500 billion of our wealth a year alone to China and about $800 billion to the rest of the world, total. And when you run a trade deficit, there's some people who think that trade deficits aren't bad. Well, let me tell you, when you run a trade deficit and you're shipping your wealth off, right? You're also shipping your jobs and factories off. Like $1 billion of deficit is about 6,000 jobs that are over there, not here. You scale that up into the hundreds of billions and it's millions of jobs. And the second part of it is when you have like $500 billion go off to foreign shores, it's like a reverse mortgage. Because that money comes back and it buys up your houses and your factories and your farmland and your stocks. It's like, oh, well, if they buy stocks, that's okay. Well, it's not okay in the sense that what you've done is you've lost that capital income within our borders. Or if they buy a factory here, you've lost that capital income. So tariffs are a way of addressing the unfair trade practices that these other countries have. And by the way, our tariffs are lower on average than everybody else's, right? And our deficits are higher. Is there a correlation? I think so. Why is it that if we try to sell a car to China, they put a tariff of 25% on and ours is 2.5%? If we try to sell a car to Germany, they put a tariff of 10% on. We put a tariff of 2.5% on. We run a $370 billion trade deficit with China every year, $70 billion with Germany, $69 billion with Japan, $38 billion with Vietnam, $70 billion with Mexico. Those are jobs and wealth going offshore. And President Donald J. Trump got it back in the 80s. He saw what was happening all the way back in the 80s. And the case for free trade died the day NAFTA was passed. And it died a second death the day China got into the World Trade Organization in 2001. So how do I square protectionism with the free trade model? That's how I square it. We want free, fair, and reciprocal trade, and we stand up for the American worker. All right, let's see what else. We'll take, yeah, there we go. I can't get an applause for the friggin' Jones Act in here, but you applaud that. My deputy got more applause on Saturday. He was at a ship christening for Crowley. He sends me a text. Wow, I got 3 applause. It's great. I come here and I'm just a dud. Oh, man. Yeah. Either that or would you get too much sugar coma out there in the audience at the break? Let's see, anything else? How can this administration be satisfied with the size of our U.S. flag fleet? What can be done to strengthen the key enabler for military employability? Look, we're trying. The president has pledged to increase the size of our Navy. This assessment here focuses on, among other things, the fact that after 10 years of sequestration, we're really losing our ability to build ships. This is the thing people don't understand. It's like this is not an on-off switch, right? It's like a Bob Dylan song. If you're not busy being born, is busy dying, right? And so if your shipbuilding industry is seeing these craftsmen migrate outside the industry for lack of work over 5 or 8 or 10 years, they don't just pop back in, particularly if they were in their 50s when they started doing that. Then you don't have an apprenticeship program for the people in their 30s. So we're working on it. I guess the next thing you get to do is fun. Where are you going next? Isn't there like a... You don't have fun. All right. Well, look, it's been a great pleasure to be with you today. I'll be on my way, and know that this White House and this president is fighting for you and working with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Navarro. And please know we appreciate your service to our nation. And if there's anything we can ever do for you, please let us know. Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, I hope you found this morning's discussions productive and enlightening. It's far from over. After lunch, we will continue with our Transportation Academy. And tomorrow we'll wrap up events with the committee meetings. And I want to make sure everybody knows that committee meetings are open to anyone who is in attendance. And then lastly, thank you to TRANSCOM for your willingness to, again this year, to co-sponsor this event, and how much we appreciate your staff and the work they've done. Complete the surveys. We've got the schedule slide up here for today. Lastly, mark your calendars for St. Louis next year. It's our 75th anniversary. So this concludes the plenary sessions. Please enjoy the lunch and have a great day. Thanks.